Chapter 1: The Arena of Ash. Blood and dust are the only things that satisfy a hollow king. I sat upon the high throne of the northern arena, my fingers tapping rhythmically against the cold obsidian armrest. Below me, the regional tournament was a pathetic display of meat hitting meat, wolves desperate to prove they were more than cursed. It was boring. In fact, it was worse than boring. It was a reminder that my kingdom had grown soft. I rule by strength because strength is the only language that doesn't lie. My gaze drifted over the crowd, a sea of snarling faces and sweaty fur. I sought a spark, a weapon, a reason to believe my line wouldn't end in stagnant peace. After that, a heavy silence fell over the stands, and the air temperature plummeted. My skin prickled as if 1,000 needles of ice were pressing against my pores. Truth be told, I hadn't felt an energy like this in a decade, not since the Great War. Suddenly, a shockwave of raw, ancient power ripped through the center of the ring. It wasn't the hot, musk-filled energy of a common alpha. Rather, it was cold. It was primordial. It was the kind of power that could level a mountain or freeze a heart mid-beat. No matter how hard I tried to stay composed, my wolf stood at the edge of my consciousness, pacing and bare-toothed. Because of that, I leaned forward, my eyes narrowing as the dust began to settle. What followed was a sight that made the breath hitch in my throat. In the center of the ring stood 2 children, not more than 10 winters old. They were small, dressed in rags, but they stood tall over the unconscious body of my most elite tournament champion. The warrior was a mountain of muscle, yet he lay broken like a discarded doll. Meanwhile, the boy and the girl stood back to back, their eyes glowing with a silver light that shouldn't exist in this age. What's worse was the silence. Thousands of wolves were in that arena, but not one of them dared to draw a breath. The tension broke when the boy looked up, his silver gaze locking onto mine with a defiance that was almost physical. He didn't bow. He didn't tremble. Instead, he smiled, a small, predatory thing that chilled my marrow. I felt it, clear as day, that the world had just shifted beneath my feet. The space between us burned as I stood up from my throne. I am the Alpha King, the unyielding, the man who cast away his own heart to ensure the purity of his pack. Yet, looking at these 2 prodigies, I felt like a beggar staring at a feast. Deep down, I knew the truth, my boring afternoon was over, and a storm was coming that I wasn't prepared for. Chapter 2: The Command of the King. I descended the stone stairs like a shadow falling over the sun. Every step I took felt heavy, my boots crunching on the blood-soaked sand of the arena floor. The 2 children didn't move an inch as I approached, even as my royal guards fanned out to surround them. They were like statues carved from ice and iron. Before I could move any closer, the boy stepped in front of the girl, his tiny hands balled into fists. "Stay back," the boy hissed, his voice a low vibration that seemed to shake the very ground. I scoffed, my pride flaring like a torch in a dark cave. I am Alaric, the king whose word is law. So, I drew in a breath and let my commanding voice roar, a power meant to bring even the strongest alphas to their knees. "Kneel!" I barked, the sound rippling through the air like a physical blow. But then, nothing happened. The children didn't flinch. Their knees didn't buckle. In fact, they looked at me with a mixture of confusion and growing anger. My heart skipped a beat because no one, absolutely no one, resists the king's voice. It was an impossible challenge to my authority. As the silence stretched, I realized these weren't just talented whelps, they were anomalies. "Where is your alpha?" I demanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Who raised you?" Soon after, a woman came screaming from the sidelines. She was plain, her clothes stained with the juices of herbs, her hair a messy tangle of brown. She threw herself into the dirt between me and the children, her body trembling with a terror so thick I could almost taste it. She was unremarkable, a nobody from a border village. Yet, as she bowed, her scent hit me like a physical punch to the gut. It was the smell of mountain air and pressed wildflowers. It was the scent of the woman I had thrown away 10 years ago for being weak. At that moment, something inside me cracked. I looked at her, searching for a trace of the girl I once knew, but the woman before me was a stranger with hollow eyes. Still, the children shared her features. They had her chin, her stubborn lip, and my "no, that was impossible." "Please, Your Majesty," she sobbed, her voice trembling like a leaf in a gale. "They are just children. They didn't mean it. We are nothing." Despite that, I reached down and gripped her chin, forcing her to look up. She looked like a peasant, but her skin felt like silk against my rough palms. My wolf began to howl, a mournful, confused sound that I suppressed with a wall of iron. I didn't care who she was now. I only cared about the power those children possessed. Because they were mine by right of the blood decree. "They are coming with me," I announced, my voice cold and final. "And you, Nanny, you will come to serve them, or you will watch them go alone." Chapter 3: The Ghost in the Citadel. The carriage ride to the Obsidian Citadel was a study in suffocating tension. I watched them from the shadows of my private balcony as they arrived, 3 small figures dwarfed by the massive stone towers of my home. The children were squirming, their eyes darting everywhere with a curiosity that felt like a threat. Behind them, the woman, the nanny, walked with her head down, a ghost in a place she should have ruled. What followed was a week of pure, unadulterated chaos. My citadel, usually a place of silent discipline, was now a playground for 2 monsters. They didn't just train, they destroyed. They broke the swords of my instructors and laughed when the veterans fell. Still, every time I tried to corner them, the nanny was there, pulling them back with a soft word that they actually listened to. I found myself wandering the halls at night, drawn to the wing where they were housed. One evening, I found the nanny in the great library. She was sitting by the fire, reading a book of ancient lore to the children. She looked so peaceful, so invisible, yet she commanded the room's peace better than I ever could. As if pulled by a string, I stepped into the light. "You don't belong here, Eloan," I said, her old name slipping from my lips before I could stop it. She didn't jump. She didn't even look up at first. Rather, she closed the book slowly and stood, her posture as stiff as a soldier's. "My name is Vance, my king," she replied, her voice as flat as a dead sea. "The woman you knew is dead. You killed her the day you sent her into the snow because she wasn't strong enough for your bed." The words burned because they were true. I had chosen the crown over the mate, believing a king needed a warrior, not a lover. Yet, as the wind shifted, her scent filled my lungs again, richer than before. She was suppressing something. I could feel the hum of energy beneath her skin, hidden by a wall of sheer will. "The children," I started, stepping closer until the space between us burned. "They have power that belongs to my line." "How?" Truth be told, she looked like she wanted to strike me. Instead, she just bowed, a mocking gesture that didn't reach her eyes. "Fate is a cruel mistress, Alaric. Maybe she gave them what you were too blind to see in me." With that, she gathered the sleeping children and left me alone in the dark. I stood there, my pulse racing, realizing that I didn't just have squires in my house. I had a revolution. The 3 treasures were finally under my roof, but as the silence roared, I realized I was the one who was truly caged. I would have them. I would have the truth. And eventually, I would have her back, even if I had to burn the world to do it. Chapter 4: The King's Shadow. My palace had become a battlefield of subtle humiliations. I sat at my desk, staring at the ruin of my royal seals. Someone, and I knew exactly which 2 small terrors it was, had replaced my ink with a permanent, glowing violet dye. Every document I touched now shimmered with a ridiculous, ethereal light. Still, I found I couldn't summon the rage that usually governed my soul. I felt a strange, bubbling heat in my chest that felt suspiciously like amusement. What followed was a week of absolute bureaucratic nightmare. My maps were rearranged so that the northern territories were upside down, and the dining hall chairs had been greased with a substance that made my fiercest generals slide onto the floor. Truth be told, I hadn't felt this challenged since I took the throne. My wolf was no longer pacing in anger, he was watching the door, waiting for the nanny to arrive so he could catch a glimpse of the woman behind the sabotage. Next, I found her in the hallway, trying to scrub violet footprints off the marble floor. Her face was flushed, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps as she worked. Deep down, I knew the truth, she was helping them. She was the architect of this chaos, providing the herbal concoctions they used for their pranks. I stepped into her path, my shadow stretching long and dark over her small frame. "Your children are a menace, Vance," I rumbled, my voice vibrating with a playful threat. She stopped scrubbing, her shoulders tensing as she looked up. The tension broke when she saw my violet-stained fingers. A tiny, traitorous smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth before she could mask it with a cough. In that moment, her eyes weren't the hollow pits of a servant, they were bright, sharp, and filled with a secret fire that made my blood sing. "They are merely expressive, Your Majesty," she replied, her voice steady despite the proximity. "Perhaps they will find your palace a bit dull." What's worse was that I agreed with her. I stepped closer, closing the gap until I could smell the sharp tang of the cleaning vinegar and the soft, sweet scent of her skin. As the silence stretched, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wanted to scold her, but instead, I found myself reaching out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Her breath caught, and for a single heartbeat, the world narrowed down to the heat radiating between us. Chapter 5: The Midpoint Shift. The moon was a silver scythe hanging over the garden as I walked the perimeter of the citadel. I couldn't sleep, my skin felt too tight, my mind a whirlpool of violet ink and wildflower scents. Eventually, I found myself near the fountain where Aloan, Vance, was sitting alone. She was staring into the water, her silhouette looking fragile yet unyielding against the dark stone. As if pulled by a string, I walked toward her, my footsteps silent on the grass. "I am not a good man," I said, the confession leaving my lips before I could think. She didn't turn around. Rather, she shifted her weight, making room for me on the stone bench. "A good man wouldn't need to say it, Alaric. A king only cares about being a strong man." Because of that, I sat down, the weight of the crown feeling heavier than ever before. I spoke to her about the maid I had lost, the girl I had judged by the seer's scales and found wanting. I told her how I had traded my soul for a prophecy of pure blood. As the silence roared, I realized I was confessing my greatest sins to the woman I had committed them against. Her world tilted, and I saw a tear track a silver path down her cheek. "I was wrong," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I thought strength was the absence of weakness. But looking at those children, looking at you, I realize I've been a fool." Without warning, she turned to me, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of agony and hope. I reached for her hand, and this time, she didn't pull away. The space between them burned as our fingers intertwined. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I realized I was falling for a peasant nanny, a woman who shouldn't exist in my world of alphas and omegas. In fact, I was ready to rewrite every law in the kingdom just to see her smile. Chapter 6: The Seer's Eye. Meanwhile, High Seer Vane watched us from the high balcony, his face a mask of cold stone. He had seen the way I looked at the nanny, and he had sensed the children's resistance to my voice. To make things worse, he knew a secret that I had only begun to suspect. He retreated into the shadows of his tower, his fingers trembling as he pulled an ancient, jagged mirror from a velvet-lined box. Not only that, but he began to chant in a tongue that tasted of copper and old graves. He needed to prove that the weakling had returned to steal the throne. Truth be told, Vayne didn't care about the kingdom's strength, he cared about his own control. If the king mated with a woman who couldn't be controlled, Vayne's power would vanish like mist in the sun. That night, he sent his shadows into the nanny's quarters, searching for the blood he needed to confirm his fears. Come morning, the palace felt different. The air was thick with a new kind of tension, a storm brewing just behind the horizon. I walked to the training yard, watching the twins spar with a ferocity that defied their age. More importantly, I saw the way they looked at me, not with hatred, but with a cautious, growing curiosity. Something inside me shifted, and I realized I wanted to be more than their king. I wanted to be their father. Yet, as I approached them, a cold wind swept through the courtyard. Before either could speak, a messenger from the seer arrived, his face pale as death. The seer requests your presence at the banquet of truth, my king. He claims to have found a discrepancy in the bloodline of your squires. She didn't know what scared her more, the threat to her children or the look of dawning realization in my eyes. The trap was set, and the three treasures were about to be tested in a way I could never have imagined. Chapter 7: The Banquet of Truth. The great hall of the Obsidian Citadel felt like a tomb draped in velvet. Truth be told, I hated these formal banquets, but today the air was different, it was heavy, charged with the scent of ozone and impending lightning. I sat at the head of the long table, my fingers white-knuckled against the arms of my throne. To my left, the nanny sat among the low-ranking staff, her face a mask of pale marble. Soon after, High Seer Vayne stood, his silken robes hissing against the stone floor as he approached the center of the room. Without warning, Vayne pulled a heavy cloth away from a massive, jagged object. It was the Mirror of Origin, an artifact from the First Age that stripped away every lie, every glamour, and every layer of suppression. Before I could move, he channeled a surge of dark energy into the glass. A beam of blinding, silver light erupted from the mirror, sweeping across the room like a physical scythe. At that moment, I felt my own wolf roar in response to the ancient magic, but my eyes were locked on the woman in the corner. As the silence roared, the light hit her. I watched, paralyzed, as the nanny's plain, wrinkled skin seemed to melt away like wax in a fire. Her mousy hair flared into a deep, rich mahogany, and her hunched posture straightened into the regal line of an alpha. And just like that, everything changed. Standing before the entire high court was Elara, not the broken girl I had discarded, but a woman radiating a power so vast it made the seer's magic look like a flickering candle. Chapter 8: The Shattered Crown. What followed was a chaos I couldn't contain. The court erupted in gasps and snarls as the mirror's light shifted, hitting the twins who stood by the kitchens. Their small forms glowed with the same silver intensity as Elara, their true sense, my scent, filling the hall like a thunderclap. Because of that, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They weren't just prodigies. They were my sons. They were the heirs I had been told would never exist if I stayed with a weak mate. To make things worse, Vayne stepped toward Elara with a sneer of triumph. "Behold the traitor," he screamed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "The woman who stole the king's seeds and hid them in the mud. She has returned to poison our bloodline with her deception." Yet, I couldn't move. I was drowning in the guilt of 10 years, staring at the woman I had failed and the children I had unknowingly tried to break in training. Deep down, I knew the truth. Vayne had lied to me a decade ago to maintain his grip on the throne. As the tension broke, I stood up, my commanding voice ripping through the hall to silence the baying nobles. "Enough!" I roared, but my voice lacked its usual iron. I looked at Elara, searching for a spark of the love we once had, but all I found was a mother's murderous protective instinct. She didn't know what scared her more, my wrath or the fact that I was finally seeing her for who she truly was. Chapter 9: The Descent into Darkness. Next, the palace guards moved in, acting on Vane's standing orders for treasonous entities. No matter how hard she tried, Eloan couldn't fight them all while shielding the boys from the seer's binding spells. I watched as they shackled her in cold iron, the only metal that could suppress an alpha's soul. As if pulled by a string, I walked toward her as the guards dragged her away, but she spat at my feet, her eyes burning with a silver fire that promised only death. "You are not a king," she hissed, her voice a jagged blade. "You are just a lonely man in a cage of your own making." What followed was the sound of the dungeon doors slamming shut, a sound that felt like the final nail in the coffin of my heart. Moments later, Vane approached me, his eyes gleaming with a sick satisfaction. "The bastards must be purified, my king. For the safety of the realm." Instead of agreeing, I turned on him, my claws extending as my wolf fought for control. Between one breath and the next, I realized that my entire reign had been a lie built on a seer's greed. Truth be told, I didn't care about the laws of the pack anymore. I had spent a decade being unyielding, and it had left me with nothing but ash. That night, as I sat alone on my throne, I realized that to save my family, I would have to become the very thing I feared most, a traitor to my own crown. Chapter 10: The Iron Whisper. The throne room felt like a hollow skull, and I was the ghost haunting it. Truth be told, the silence was louder than the screams of the banquet. I paced the obsidian floor, my claws leaving jagged white scores in the precious stone. What's worse was the smell, the lingering scent of Eloan's fear, and the twins' defiant silver magic still hung in the air like a bitter perfume. I had spent 10 years building these walls to keep my kingdom safe, but eventually, I realized I had only succeeded in building my own tomb. Before she could move to the deeper pits, I had seen the way Eloan looked at the shackles. It wasn't defeat, it was a promise of a reckoning. Moments later, High Seer Vane entered, his footsteps echoing with an arrogance that made my fur bristle. He began to drone on about blood purity and the cleansing of the line, but I didn't hear a word. Instead, I was listening to the rhythmic thumping of my own heart, which was finally beating for something other than duty. "The children will be moved to the Sun Tower at dawn," Vane announced, his voice oily and thin. "Because of that, the purification ritual can begin under the morning light." I didn't roar. I didn't snarl. Rather, I turned to him with a smile so cold it stopped the breath in his throat. I realized then that if I wanted to win, I had to stop playing the king and start playing the monster Vane had turned me into. In fact, I would let him think he was in control right up until I ripped his world apart. Chapter 11: Shadows in the Stone. While the forest held its breath outside the walls, the subterranean levels of the citadel were coming alive. I used my internal map of the palace, tunnels known only to the Alpha Line, to bypass the royal guards. As if pulled by a string, I slipped into the shadows of the north wing, my wolf senses dialed to their absolute limit. Between one breath and the next, I heard a sound that didn't belong in a dungeon: laughter. It was a small, high-pitched giggle that could only belong to Elara. Soon after, I reached the iron bars of the primary holding cell. I expected to find them weeping. Instead, I found the guards frozen like statues in the hallway, their faces twisted in expressions of ridiculous confusion. Inside the cell, Kale was sitting cross-legged, his small hands glowing with a soft, pulsing silver light. What followed was a sight that defied every law of magic I knew. He was using his ancient power to turn the iron bars into brittle stalks of sugar cane, which his sister was happily snapping and stacking in the corner. "He's here," Kale whispered, not looking up. She didn't know what scared her more, he mocked, mimicking his mother's voice, "The king's shadow or the king's smell." The boy looked at me then, his silver eyes cutting through the dark. Truth be told, I felt like a child in the presence of a god. These weren't just my sons, they were the evolution of our race, and I had almost let a bitter old man drain them for purity. "I'm here to get you out," I said, my voice thick with a father's desperate hope. Yet, Kale stood up and walked to the bars, his expression far too old for his face. We don't need a king to save us, Alaric. We need a father to find our mother. She's in the black pit. The seer moved her because she was noisy. As the silence roared, I realized noisy meant Eloan was finally letting her wolf scream, and the sound was beginning to crack the citadel's foundations. Chapter 12, The Black Pit's Song. Without thinking, I threw my weight against the remaining iron, the sugar-brittle metal shattering under my strength. I scooped the twins up, one in each arm, their small bodies surprisingly heavy with raw power. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I could feel Eloan's energy calling to me from the depths. It was a low, vibrating hum that made my marrow ache. Not only that, but the very stones of the palace began to groan as if the mountain itself were trying to bow to her. To make things worse, the alarm bells began to toll, a frantic, clanging sound that signaled the guards had found the empty banquet hall. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't suppress my own scent anymore. My wolf was in full command, his eyes glowing with the same gold that had once marked me as the ultimate predator. Just like that, the hunt was on. I ran through the dark, the twins clinging to my neck, while the sound of clashing steel began to echo from the upper floors. What followed was the descent into the black pit. The air grew thick with the smell of ancient damp and the metallic tang of Eloan's suppressed alpha aura. As the wind shifted, I saw her. She was suspended by silver chains in the center of a lightless room, her mahogany hair shielding her face. But then, she looked up. The silver in her eyes had turned to a blinding white, and the chains were glowing red-hot where they touched her skin. "Alaric," she whispered, and when her name left his lips, the room exploded in a shockwave of silver light. As her wolf stirred, I realized I wasn't just here to rescue her. I was here to witness the rebirth of the mate I had been too blind to keep. As if fate demanded it, I stepped into the light, ready to burn my crown and my life just to see her free. The stakes had never been higher, and between them, something cracked, the last remnants of the king's pride, leaving only the man who would do anything for his own. Chapter 13, The Uncaging. The black pit roared. Truth be told, it wasn't a growl, but a sound like 1,000 silver bells shattering all at once, an ancient hum that vibrated through my very bones. Eloan hung suspended by those glowing silver chains, her body arching back as pure, raw alpha energy pulsed around her. What's worse was that the silver was supposed to suppress her, but it was amplifying her, turning her pain into a weapon. My wolf, usually the hunter, whimpered in awe and fear. As if fate demanded it, I stepped into the blinding light, my instincts surging. I didn't care about the pain. I didn't care about the seer's guards clanging down the tunnel toward us. Instead, my focus narrowed to one thing, freeing her. "Eloan!" I bellowed, my own voice fighting against the primal scream now emanating from her. "Look at me!" As her wolf stirred, her head snapped up, those white-hot eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, she didn't recognize me, just a threat. But then, the children, Kale and Lyra, burst into the pit, their silver magic flaring around their small forms. "Mama," they cried, their voices cutting through the chaotic energy. And just like that, everything changed. The pure white light around Eloan dimmed, replaced by a softer, golden glow, the color of hearth and home, of protection. Meanwhile, the first of Vane's elite guards burst into the pit, their armor gleaming in the eerie light. Before she could move, Eloan's eyes flickered to them, and a growl rose in her throat, a sound that was pure, untamed alpha. "They touch my children," she hissed, her voice a low vibration that made the stones weep dust. "And they die." Which meant I had to fight not just for her, but with her. My life as king was over, my life as her protector had just begun. Chapter 14, The Royal Gauntlet. What followed was a battle unlike any I had ever fought. My claws, once weapons of order, were now tools of rebellion. Eloan, still tethered by the pulsing silver chains, moved with a grace and ferocity that shocked me. She ripped through the guards with a terrifying elegance, her magic lashing out like silver whips. Not only that, but the twins, my sons, were a blur of motion, their ancient powers turning the guards' weapons into water and their armor into dust. To make things worse, Vane's personal guard, massive alphas clad in black, descended into the pit, wielding enchanted blades designed to sever a shifter's connection to their wolf. Deep down, I knew the truth: we couldn't win this fight in the tunnels. We needed to expose Vane in the light, where his lies would be his undoing. The throne room! I roared, my voice raw but strong. He's there! As the bond pulsed between Eloan and me, I felt her answer, a surge of primal agreement. So, I fought my way to her, ripping at the silver chains with my bare hands. Each link burned my skin, but I ignored the pain. Maybe it was fate, but as the last chain snapped, her freed energy slammed into me, a jolt of pure connection that solidified the mate bond Vane had tried to deny for years. After that, our scents merged, mine, of cold iron and fury, hers, of wildflowers and untamed power. Still, as we pushed toward the exit, the twins created a diversion, a localized earthquake that sent guards tumbling. With every heartbeat, Eloan and I moved as one, a dance of death and defiance. The Obsidian Citadel, my fortress, had become our cage, and we were breaking free. As if the world narrowed, I knew this wasn't just about escaping. This was about reclaiming everything that had been stolen from us, and we would do it together, no matter the cost. Chapter 15: The Public Vow. Eventually, we burst onto the main floor of the Citadel, a scene of absolute pandemonium. Guards were scrambling, nobles were fleeing, and the central courtyard was a mess of shattered statues and trampled banners. Meanwhile, Vane, alerted by the commotion, stood on the high balcony overlooking the courtyard, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "Traitors!" he shrieked, his voice echoing through the courtyard. "The king has fallen prey to the seductress and her impure offspring. They seek to usurp the throne." Instead of engaging Vane immediately, I stopped in the very center of the courtyard, my back to the cheering and terrified crowd. Eloan stood beside me, her hand gripping mine, her power a tangible force radiating from her. The twins stood proudly, defiantly, in front of us. As the air thickened, I pulled her to me, my mouth finding hers in a kiss that was both desperate and defiant. It wasn't gentle, it was a hungry, searing promise, a public claim. That's why, when I finally broke away, my voice was hoarse but steady. "These are my family!" I roared, my eyes blazing, scanning the faces of every noble, every guard, every loyalist in my kingdom. "And I will burn this entire citadel to the ground before I let another hair on their heads be harmed." Not only that, but my Wolf King's declaration resonated through the stone, shaking the very foundations of power. What's worse was that Vane screamed in fury, throwing a blast of dark energy that slammed into the courtyard between us, creating a chasm of smoking stone. As the sky darkened, I realized this was it. The point of no return. I had publicly rejected my crown for my family. The fight was no longer just for survival, it was for the future of the entire kingdom, and it would be fought right here, right now. The king was dead. Long live the father. Chapter 16: The Shattered Mirror. The chasm Vane ripped into the courtyard hissed with the smell of scorched earth and sulfur. Truth be told, the ground felt like it was grieving, the ancient stone of the citadel groaning as it split apart. I stood on the edge of the abyss, my hands still locked in Eloan's, but the physical gap between us and the throne was nothing compared to the darkness Vane was about to unleash. What's worse was that the seer wasn't finished. He pulled a jagged obsidian dagger from his robes, the blade dripping with a liquid that hummed with a sickly, violet light. Without warning, Vane didn't strike at me. He struck at the air, carving a sigil of blood that pulsed with a rhythm like a dying heart. Because of that, the very atmosphere of the courtyard curdled. My wolf, usually a titan of strength, suddenly felt as though his veins were being filled with lead. I watched in horror as Alolan gasped, her knees buckling as the silver light of her aura began to flicker and dim. Still, she reached for the twins, but her fingers passed through the air as if she were losing her grip on reality itself. To make things worse, the seer's true plan finally unraveled. This wasn't just a battle for the crown, it was a harvest. You think you found your strength, Alaric? Vane's voice drifted down from the balcony, oily and cold. You merely brought the 3 treasures to my altar. Their ancient blood will fuel a reign that lasts 1,000 years, one where I am the god, and you are the footstool. As the silence roared, I realized my own desperate love had been the final key Vane needed to spring his trap. Chapter 17, The Weight of the Crown. Moments later, the violet mist turned into physical chains of shadow. They didn't just bind our limbs, they bound our souls. I felt my connection to the twins vanish, a hollow ache opening in my chest where their heartbeats had once echoed. No matter how hard she tried, Alolan couldn't reach them. The twins were being pulled toward the chasm, their silver eyes wide with a terror that broke my spirit more than any blade could. What followed was the sound of Vane's laughter, a jagged thing that cut through the screams of the fleeing nobles. By the time I managed to stand, the world was spinning. I looked at Alolan, but she was fading. The weakness I had once mocked was now the only thing left of her as Vane's curse stripped away her power. Truth be told, I was the one who was weak. I had led her into this trap. I had been so arrogant, thinking a king's decree could protect a family I had once discarded. As her name left his lips, it was a choked sob, not a command. I was a king of ash, ruling over a kingdom of ghosts. Between one breath and the next, the seer unleashed his final blow. He cast a spell of total rejection, a psychological poison that forced me to relive the moment I sent Alolan into the snow. In the echo of his voice, I felt her original pain magnified 1,000 times. I felt the twins' resentment, the cold, the hunger, the years of hiding. Which meant I was drowning in my own guilt, my wolf retreating into the darkest corners of my mind. The all is lost moment wasn't a physical defeat, it was the realization that I might never be worthy of their forgiveness. Chapter 18, The Dark Night of the Alpha. That night, the citadel was silent, save for the weeping of the wind. Vane had imprisoned us in the glass cages of the high spire, where the moonlight only served to highlight our failure. I watched Alolan through the transparent walls. She was curled in a ball, her mahogany hair dull, her spirit seemingly broken. As the sky darkened, I looked at my hands, the hands that had held a scepter but couldn't hold a family. I had reached my lowest point, a king stripped of his crown, his wolf, and his hope. Deep down, I knew the truth. Vane was preparing the ritual for the dawn. He would drain the twins to achieve immortality, and he would keep Alolan and me alive just to watch it. She didn't know what scared her more, the coming death or the look of utter defeat on my face. Yet, as I sat in the darkness, a small, cold hand touched the glass from the outside. I looked up, my heart skipping, to see Kale. He was pale, his silver glow nearly gone, but his eyes were still filled with that stubborn, mahogany fire. He thinks he won, the boy whispered, his voice vibrating through the glass. Instead, he forgot one thing. You're not just a king, Alaric. You're a father. And a father doesn't need a wolf to fight. As her wolf stirred in the next cage, I felt a spark of something new. It wasn't the roar of an alpha, it was the quiet, steady hum of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. As the wind shifted, I realized that the descent into darkness was the only way to find the light. The ritual was coming, but so was I. Chapter 19, The Father's Spark. The glass cage felt like a coffin of moonlight, but the small, cold hand of my son against the pane was a lightning rod for my soul. Truth be told, I had spent my life thinking my power came from my bloodline, yet in this moment of absolute darkness, I realized it came from the small, shivering boy standing in the wind. As the silence roared, I pressed my palm against his, the glass the only thing separating a failure of a king from a child who still believed in him. "Kale, get back," I whispered, my voice cracking like parched earth. "Rather, find your sister. If you can move through the shadows, you have to hide." Instead of running, the boy leaned his forehead against the glass. "He took the silver from us, Alaric. But he couldn't take the iron." Before I could move, Kale pulled a small, jagged piece of the sugarcane iron he had snapped in the pits from his tunic. He pressed it into the seal of the glass cage. Without thinking, I realized the boy wasn't trying to break the glass, he was grounding the magic. As if pulled by a string, the violet mist surrounding my cage drained into the shard, and with a sound like a dying gasp, the seal shattered. Moments later, I was out. I didn't feel like an alpha king, I felt like a man possessed by a quiet, murderous purpose. Next, I moved to Eloan's cage. She was still, her breath coming in shallow hitches. I didn't use magic to free her. Rather, I used the jagged iron and the raw strength of my own desperate hands to pry the frame apart. As the wind shifted, she fell into my arms, her body cold as stone. "Eloan, wake up," I urged, tucking her head against my chest. "Because of that connection we share, you have to hear me. I am a fool. I am a monster. But I am yours." As the silence stretched, I felt her heart give a sudden, violent throb against mine. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, her eyes snapped open, no longer white or silver, but a deep, burning amber. And just like that, everything changed. She didn't need the ancient power to be strong, she just needed a reason to fight. Chapter 20, The Silent Revolution. What followed was a descent through the citadel that was as silent as a predator's breath. We didn't shift into our wolves, instead, we moved as humans, utilizing the very weakness Vayne despised to slip past the magical sensors that tracked alpha signatures. Not only that, but we found Lyra in the kitchens, hiding in the flour bins, her small face set in a mask of grim determination. By the time we reached the armory, we were a pack of shadows, armed with nothing but iron and a shared, silent vow. "The ritual starts when the sun touches the altar," Eloan whispered, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. "More importantly, he will be vulnerable when he starts the drain. That is when we strike." Truth be told, I looked at her and saw the queen I had never deserved. She wasn't just surviving, she was strategizing. Between one breath and the next, I realized that her weakness had always been a superior form of intelligence, a patience that I, in my arrogance, had mistaken for fragility. To make things worse, we could hear the chanting from the courtyard, a low, rhythmic thrum that made the very air feel oily. Without another word, I led them through the servant tunnels, the narrow passages where I had once sent Eloan to hide. Now, they were my highway to redemption. As the sky darkened just before dawn, I felt the mark on my neck, the one I had tried to ignore for a decade, begin to tingle. Her soul answered, and for the first time in 10 years, the bond was clear, a golden thread pulling us toward our destiny. Chapter 21, The Edge of the Abyss. Eventually, we reached the balcony overlooking the great altar. Below us, Vayne stood with his arms raised, the violet mist now a swirling vortex that was dragging the remaining silver light from the sky. What's worse was the sight of my people, my pack, kneeling in the dirt, their will suppressed by the seer's blood magic. Deep down, I knew the truth, this wasn't just about my family anymore. It was about every soul I had failed as a king. "Wait for the flash," I instructed, my hand hovering over the hilt of a stolen iron blade. As if fate whispered, I knew that once I stepped onto that altar, there was no going back to the man I was. I was ready to die to make things right. No matter how hard she tried, Eloan couldn't hide the fear in her eyes, but she gripped my arm, her strength anchoring me. "We do this together, Alaric. As a pack." Just like that, the first ray of sun hit the obsidian altar. Without warning, Vane let out a triumphant roar, and the violet vortex began to descend. The tension broke. I didn't wait for a sign. Her body moved on instinct, and mine followed. We leaped from the balcony, a blur of shadow and iron, falling toward the man who had stolen our lives. As the silence roared in my ears, I realized that I wasn't a king ruling by strength. I was a man fighting for love, and that night, or rather, that morning, Vane would learn the difference. Chapter 22, The Altar of Reckoning. I hit the stone floor like a falling star, the impact vibrating through my teeth. Truth be told, the obsidian altar didn't feel like a holy place, it felt like a cold, hungry mouth. Without warning, the violet vortex above us buckled as my iron blade sliced through the tether of the seer's ritual. Vane shrieked, a sound of pure, jagged agony that ripped through the chanting crowd. What's worse was the backlash, a wave of dark energy that slammed into my chest, trying to stop my heart. As her wolf stirred, Eloan landed beside me, her amber eyes glowing with a heat that rivaled the rising sun. She didn't hesitate. Instead, she moved with the fluid lethality of a storm, her hands weaving through the air to catch the falling silver threads of the twins' stolen power. Moments later, Kale and Lyra were on the altar with us, their small hands pressing against the cold stone. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Eloan funneled her own aura into them, using herself as a bridge to give them back their ancient strength. To make things worse, Vane recovered, his face a twisted mask of desperation. He lunged at Lyra with his obsidian dagger, but before the words left her lips, I threw myself between them. The blade bit deep into my shoulder, a searing, oily pain that tasted of death. Yet, I didn't fall. Rather, I grabbed his wrist, my hand crushing bone until the dagger clattered to the floor. In that moment, I wasn't the king who ruled by fear, I was the shield that protected the innocent. Chapter 23, The Fall of the Seer. What followed was a symphony of retribution. Eloan and the twins joined their hands, and as the bond pulsed, a pillar of pure, white gold light erupted from the altar. It wasn't the cold, ancient power of the past, it was a new kind of magic, fueled by the love of a mother and the resolve of a father. Not only that, but the light swept through the courtyard, shattering the blood magic chains that held my people. By the time Vane tried to scream a final curse, the light consumed his voice. As the silence roared, the violet mist evaporated, leaving the seer standing small and frail in the center of the ruins. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a realization that came too late. Because of that, he saw the truth: strength isn't found in the purity of blood, but in the purity of the heart's devotion. Without thinking, the crowd of suppressed wolves rose as one, a sea of fur and fury that surged toward the man who had lied to them for a generation. As if pulled by a string, I stepped back, letting the justice of the pack take what was left of the High Seer. Soon after, the energy on the altar settled into a soft, warm glow. I fell to my knees, the wound in my shoulder bleeding heavily, but her body moved on instinct to catch me. Eloan held me, her tears warm against my neck, while the twins curled into my sides. Between one breath and the next, the mark on my neck flared with a heat that finally felt right. I looked at the three of them, my treasures, and realized that the crown I had worn was a leaden weight, while this family was my true kingdom. Chapter 24, The New Equilibrium. That night, the Obsidian Citadel was bathed in the soft glow of 1,000 lanterns. Truth be told, the sharp edges of the palace seemed to have softened, the dark stone reflecting the warmth of a pack that was finally breathing again. I stood in the center of the courtyard, not on a throne, but among my people. What followed was the formal burning of the ancient prophecies. As the parchment turned to ash, the unyielding king died with them. In the quiet that followed, I turned to Eloan. She was dressed in her own colors now, no longer a nanny or a ghost, but the soul of this realm. Instead of a crown, I offered her my hand. No matter how hard she tried to hide it, I saw the pride in her eyes as I announced the formation of the Council of Three, a rule where empathy and strength would finally walk hand in hand. Maybe it was fate, but as the twins chased each other through the gardens, their laughter echoing off the towers, I knew we had earned this peace. Eventually, the crowd dispersed, leaving the four of us under the vast, starlit sky. As the wind shifted, I felt a peace I hadn't known in my entire life. She didn't know what scared her more, the future or the joy, but as I pulled her into my arms, the space between us burned with a different kind of fire. As if the world narrowed, I realized that the transformation was complete. I was no longer a king blinded by power, I was a man who had found his way home through the mist. Epilogue: The Rain on the Ramparts. Come morning, a soft rain began to fall over the kingdom. I stood on the ramparts, letting the cool water wash over my skin, savoring the feeling of being rained upon. Soon after, I felt a familiar presence beside me. Eloan leaned against the stone, her shoulder brushing mine, her scent of wildflowers and rain filling my senses. "The boys are demanding we teach them the shadow step again," she murmured, a playful glint in her amber eyes. As her soul answered mine, I pulled her close, watching our children play in the courtyard below. I looked at my hands, once used only for war, and then at the woman who had saved me from myself. Deep down, I knew the truth. I had been a fool who was blinded by strength, but I was now a man who was made whole by love. As the echo faded of our old lives, I realized that the three treasures weren't just the twins and Eloan, they were the hope, the heart, and the future of everything we would build together. And just like that, everything changed. Thanks for listening. Please kindly subscribe and turn on notifications for more videos.